What's up, guys? It's James Baney here with Kyle Larson, and we are getting ready to do a spoiler-filled book discussion on Thrawn Treason. Stick around. All right, so Kyle, what's up, man? How you been?
I've been good, James. How about you?
doing pretty good.
All right.
So we got a couple copies of Thrawn Treason to leaf through. How were you feeling the book?
I really enjoyed this book. I think it's definitely my favorite of the recent Thrawn novels from Timothy Zahn, and I really felt like he had a lot of fun writing this, and he was able to kind of hit the ground running with this character and the story and where everybody was going, and kind of bring everything together. How about you?
Yeah, okay. So before, because we didn't really start reading this one until kind of after it was released publicly, so we're a little bit behind on the review, if you will. But what I was hearing from people was that it was the best of the trilogy. So I was really going into it with like some excitement behind the character, or behind the three books as a whole. Did you get that vibe at all? But that people were thinking it's the best of the three?
Yeah. I had a little bit of foreknowledge because Jordan, who wrote the review, Jordan Pate for Star Wars Newsnet, wrote the review, had mentioned he thought it was the best as well. And so I definitely found that consensus as it was released, and it was because I hadn't actually finished it. It took me a little bit to finish it, and I found that consensus as well all over Twitter, especially, that people enjoyed it more than the other two.
Did you read it on like as a book, or did you do audiobook? Because I always do audiobook.
I did a little bit of both, actually. I started the book, and then I had the audiobook as well. And I had downloaded the audiobook onto an original iPod Classic. And unfortunately, that technology failed me. So I just went back to the book. So I actually did the first 2 chapters on the audiobook, but then just ended up reading the book on my Kindle instead.
All right.
Damn iPods.
Yeah, when it came to it being the best of the three, just to start off, I don't know. I would really liked that first Thrawn book, and then because it was something so interesting to like bring in this character and set him up, and I really liked, because I never read the old Thrawn books, so I don't know if that makes me at a disadvantage or a unique point of view, but I never really knew much about that character. So having come into the first book, I was like, okay, so this is Thrawn, and I really like learned him and enjoyed him, and I enjoyed watching his like rise to power, if you will, through that book itself. And then I wasn't like the biggest fan of the second one, so I was kind of like, well, I have a feeling this third one's going to fall somewhere between the two. And I would say and it does for me, but I'd say if it was somewhere between the two, it's leaning on the upper hand towards the original Thrawn rather than the Thrawn alliances, for me personally. But I know that in this book it gets a lot of I don't know. I don't want to say backlash because people really like Thrawn, but sometimes he comes off, they say, like kind of a military speak type of person. And sometimes his character and his dialogue is sort of boring. Do you find that at all? Is Thrawn a fan of are you a fan of Thrawn, the character?
I'm a fan of the character, but I would say that the points that you just made are what kind of like hold me back from being like all out gung-ho about when these books are coming out. I mean, I'm excited. I look forward to them. I look forward to kind of the exposition that they do with the greater canon. And I think Thrawn is a compelling character because he's so unique, and he's got this kind of amoral look at the galaxy when really it's a fight between good and evil. And he's like actually pretty objective. He just kind of wants to be on the winning side. And I think that's that kind of cold, like aloof outlook on the events and what's going on between the Empire and the Rebellion is something that kind of holds me back from being like, yeah, I'm a huge, Thrawn fan. Because these books, as good as they are, and as much as I appreciate Zahn's writing, I don't ever get like over the moon for them, just because of that fact that there's kind of this, Thrawn is essentially the protagonist, but at the same time, if this were any other character that I cared about in Star Wars, he'd be the antagonist. So it's hard to like, to kind of go back and forth for me, in terms of that.
That's a good point, because you watch Rebels and you're like, oh, how are our heroes and the people that I care about going to get out of this situation that this evil person is putting them in, including things, we're watching the end of Rebels, which is when this book takes place, specifically between the episodes Rebel Assault and the finale, the goodbye episode, when he makes his dramatic return. But when he makes his dramatic return, he's like, oh, I'm going to destroy everybody on the Thal, and I'm going to basically just like annihilate this city. And it's like, in a weird way, like we kind of learn that as that's the character of Thrawn. But then when you're reading some of the novels and he's like the protagonist, he's like, why do people have to die needlessly? It's like,
yeah, exactly.
It's kind of a flip for the character a little bit. That's actually interesting with him being the protagonist of this is strictly written from like an Empire official, and he's the good guy in this particular case. They almost kind of paint like Krennic as the bad guy or other Imperials as the bad guy.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where, if I were to say that I had issues with this book, it's that there wasn't really a clear antagonist. I mean, you're talking about that. Yeah, there are some Imperial officers that are adversaries, Krennic and Savit, the other Grand Admiral.
Yeah.
But and then we kind of have the Grisk, but there's not really like a clear opponent for Thrawn in this book. And if you think about it, kind of and I think maybe the reason the first Thrawn book was so good is because they did give him Night Swan. They gave him this really compelling antagonist who, for the most part, would be a protagonist for all of us. So most of the readers were kind of like, you don't really know who to root for there. But yeah, it was weird watching. I went back and watched some episodes of Rebels last night, and I was like, this guy is not a good guy, whether you want to say he's amoral or whatever, he's clearly like, somebody as intellectual and smart as that, seeing the rebellion fighting the way that they are, he has no sympathy for that. He's just kind of interested in feeling out the Empire and fortifying it as much as it can. So eventually it can be some sort of ally for the Chiss.
Yeah, it's funny because, so this whole book basically is kind of like a whodunit, like a murder mystery kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, too, because when I first read the title, I was like, Thrawn Treason. And then you kind of are like, okay, so I think what's going to happen here is they're going to kind of expose him as being maybe like too close to the Chiss. And is he actually someone who's fighting for the Empire, right? And because this is spoiler review, that doesn't happen in the book until like the very, very, very end. And so I'm reading the book and I only have like, a little bit left, like, 1/20th of this thing left. And I'm like, okay, so the term Thrawn Treason is actually more of a reference to treason within the Imperial military, and it's actually more about Savit, which is interesting too, because that very first conversation they have where it's like Krennic and Thrawn and Savit and the Emperor and who's the last person that's there? Grand Admiral Tarkin, right? Or Grand Moff Tarkin.
Or Grand Moff Tarkin. Yeah,
he's there too. And I'm looking at, I'm just look across the board and you go, well, I know what happens to him. I know what happens to him. I know what happens to him. Who's that guy? And you can almost piece together that usually when they do these types of stories that take place before movies, you're like, well, that guy's not in the movie, so he's probably not that important.
Yeah,
It almost kind of gives away that guy has something to do with this. Even though right after that meeting, he goes right into a discussion with Thrawn and he's like, oh, well, yeah, Tarkin and Krennic are just using you. So you need to choose a side on which side you're on. I think almost immediately that starts to give away that this guy has something to do more than what he's letting on. Like, why was he even in that conversation? Why was he, I don't know, part of the excerpt that they give you for the book? You know what I mean? In the promotional campaign. So there's something to do with this character. I almost thought it was kind of funny though that it seemed like they lost track of the whole, I can't think of the name of the creature, but the one that's supposed to be like attacking the lines and stuff, that almost falls away for a little while. And then they just kind of come back to it later and they're like, oh, cause it's part of the reveal of like, oh, I stopped paying attention to that because I figured out that you were hiding information, you know? And, but you go the whole book and you're like, I thought this whole thing was about him trying to figure out, how to stop those things, and then they never go back to it. And I think this is where we had discussed yesterday that the book starts to kind of fall a little bit. It's like the act 2 roughly. Yeah,
they get into what I felt was kind of like the wilderness of the plot. It kind of goes off a little bit. I wouldn't say it like goes off the rails, but you definitely get lost because, you know, initially the book starts off in such a cool way where there's this, you know, this meeting with Tarkin and Krennic and the Emperor's there, and Krennic's lackey is there, and then this new Grand Admiral we're meeting, and you're like, oh wow, this is, you know, you definitely know that there's more to it than his, you know, he's going to like to stop these super Minocs from stripping, you know, Imperial shipments.
Yeah.
So you get the feeling there's something more to it, but then it just kind of, you get so distracted by everything else that's happening with the Chiss showing up and the Grisk showing up, and you're like, wait, wasn't he supposed to be, you know, exterminating these space pests or space vermin? And then
you're following it all the way through to that point, and then it turns and it starts turning into like a versus the Grisk kind of battle. And you're like, okay, I'm following all this, but like I'm kind of having a hard time seeing where all of this is going until that final reveal.
Totally. And that to me too, it you know, it makes me want to go back and kind of reread some of those chapters because I didn't pay as close of attention. Once the Grisk show up and you see that Thrawn's attention is immediately turned to them, and you know, he's hyper focused on whatever he's working on, and says his attention immediately goes to them and why they've shown up in this part of the galaxy way sooner than he ever anticipated. And the fact that the Chiss are tracking them, that made me think that like, okay, this whole Minoc thing isn't that important. And I was confused why we kind of kept going back to it. So it made the reveal or the twist that, you know, this was actually Savit who was, you know, plundering Imperial shipments because he thought it was the right thing to do. It made that reveal a little less dramatic for me. It felt, you know, a little bit flat because of everything else going on. You're like, oh, I kind of forgot about that. So
yeah, I don't know. I kind of disagree on that point. Like, actually, when it came back to it, I was like, oh, so this is why all that stuff was important.
Yeah,
because when you first read that initial thing, I remember we were talking on the Resistance broadcast. We kind of read the review and we just did a little chat about it or whatever. And I remember the kind of feeling that John and Lacey were giving off was sort of like I don't know, it's whatever, you know, like, oh, Thrawn's going to stop some like Minoc creatures. I'm sure it's all going to play out, you know, that way. Do you think that, well, and it was interesting because it starts that way, but then that's just part of the bigger story, which is like, what happens when even the Imperials don't believe in what the Imperials are doing, and they're all like not on the same page because some of the stuff is so secretive that they're fighting over like who gets funds for the Defender ties, the TIE Defenders, and the and Project Stardust, which is obviously like a huge portion of this book, and why Krennic would even want to like begin to like sabotage some of this stuff and make sure, or try to sabotage Thrawn. He's almost kind of a footnote in this in a way.
Krennic?
Yeah.
And that actually, I wasn't too disappointed about that. Krennic's like one of my least favorite characters. I thought it was
really?
I thought it was interesting.
I like him, but I didn't like him in this book.
I mean, I like the character, like I like the role that he plays in Rogue One. I think he's, kind of the perfect antagonist for that film. But in terms of like when he shows up, like, did you read Catalyst by James Luceno?
Yes.
And, that whole book, as much as he's in it and as important as his backstory is, I like the character, the role that he serves. I just don't like the person, Krennic, I guess, because he's such a weasel. So I was kind of glad that he wasn't in it as much. And but his, that aspect of his character is really exaggerated through his lackey, Ronan, who's kind of like trying to stay loyal to his boss. He's trying to climb this corporate ladder of the Imperial industrial or military industrial complex. But he looks at it, it seems like they look at it almost more as like a corporation or a corporate structure.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that aspect of it, but kind of to get back to what you were saying, that I think it is really interesting about how Imperials all kind of knew that this Project Stardust, or the Empire putting all of their eggs into this basket of the Death Star essentially, was not a good idea, and were probably kind of baffled why somebody who plays the long game as much as Palpatine does would do something like that, would pour everything into this one project when, they're pointing out, like, Savit wasn't necessarily taking these resources to pour into the TIE Defender project, but just to kind of, I think he said I kind of reread some of that last night, that he just wanted to make sure that this went around to the rest of the fleet so that the Imperial Navy itself was fortified, rather than, because we see in all the novels kind of leading up to everything before Rogue One and A New Hope, that the Empire is just stripping the galaxy of resources, and it's all going into this Death Star, which, is not only problematic on the other side of being a subject of the Empire, but also if you're looking at it from a numbers game, it just doesn't make sense. It's like when Apple went to pour everything into the Lisa or whatever, that computer. I'm talking about Apple computers now, but and it just kind of fell flat.
Everybody knows that I don't mind talking about Apple a little bit.
All right, good. I like Apple too, so. It just kind of reminds me of that, like when like your favorite brand promises this big new release, and then it just falls flat, and they're kind of like, oh, well, where do we go from here? And I think Thrawn's the type of thinking that we just shouldn't do things like that. So,
do you think by any chance that as a character, Thrawn is too smart? Because sometimes this is why I lost interest in all the Saw movies, because I'm like, I don't care how you write a character. Sometimes you write them too intelligently, and that bothers me. I'm like, nobody could figure this out, because at the end of the day, nobody can that accurately always predict everything that's going to happen.
Yeah, I do think that holds back a lot of development we can get, because you don't really ever feel like Thrawn is threatened, very rarely. Like, that was one of the reasons I was so jarred by watching Rebels last night, other than I forgot how damn good that show is. But I was watching the finale where, Thrawn's basically, being held captive, and he's lost for what might even be the first time. And you don't really see a lot of, or you don't ever fear for the character, really, especially in these books, because Zahn has, Zahn's writing, and even he says that, like, Thrawn is always the smartest person in the room. He's probably always going to figure out what's going on, and he'll probably always win because of his genius. So that doesn't leave a lot of room for development. But with that being said, I did think it was interesting, again, when the Grisk showed up, he was immediately distracted from what he was doing, and he never outright says he's afraid, but you can tell that there's profound concern that this species has shown up, and that he might have to deal with them sooner than he was planning.
Yeah. So all that being said, we kind of get a little bit of like what possibly might be a romance for Thrawn in this. And then the way that ends is sort of like, I wish you could stay, And he's like, well, I got to go over here for now. That's what I have to do as a person. Well, I hope you can return soon because we're kind of getting worried over here that the longer you're gone. And then we know what happens in Rebels. Like, he returns, but as soon as he returns, he disappears. So all of this seems to be like Timothy Zahn writing in this sort of like, I don't know, this interesting ending, because it not only does that portion of the ending kind of set up this whole, so maybe that's what happens to the Chiss. Like, maybe Thrawn disappears and then the Chiss, for whatever reason, get destroyed because Thrawn's not around. But then at the same time, the book ends with him having this discussion with the Emperor, and the Emperor's like, I don't know, maybe I could help out the Chiss, maybe they could be part of what I become. Do you think that just falls through? Like, what are we looking at for the bigger picture? What does this mean? Because and I'm sorry to jump in with another question, but when you were saying earlier, they're putting all of this money and all the eggs into basket on the Death Star, but we also know that the Emperor has plans, backup plans. He has plans upon plans. He's got the contingency plan that we're aware of, plus whatever's going to happen in Rise of Skywalker, right? Where he potentially is brought back to life, which was never part of the contingency plan, from what we've seen in like the comics and stuff. But I don't know, where do you think all this is going?
Well, I mean, you can tell that Zahn is, I just look at this and I look at these books and feel like he probably feels a little restrained, and he's actually he hasn't said that he's restrained by the story group or anything, but he has to wait to finish kind of developing this character and where this character ends up. And he's waiting on, two people, J.J. Abrams and Dave Filoni. And I think that, to kind of use the eggs in one basket metaphor, we're also kind of putting a lot of our eggs in the basket of, what happens beyond Rebels with this character. So what I think is going to happen is, we're going to see Ezra and Thrawn have to kind of come together to face the Grisk and ultimately, whatever bigger threats are out in the unknown region. And that's an easy, prediction to make. But I think the fact that they kind of elaborated more on this system of Chiss navigators who are force sensitive with third sight, and the fact that the Chiss are now using Eli Vanto, his method of evaluating statistics to kind of figure out why their power with the Force or their connection to the Force is diminished when they get older, and why there's this kind of outlier. I can't remember her name. It's Vanaya, I think. Is that how you pronounce it? You listen to the audiobook. It's she's the one that Vanto kind of has a rapport with.
I know who you're talking about, but the name wasn't coming to me. And even when you said that right there, it didn't sound right. So you might be pronouncing it so drastically different than what they said in the book.
Sorry, Chiss listeners.
I can't think of it. Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, I thought that the way that they expanded upon her and the rest of the navigators would lead me to believe that Ezra is going to have great utility to the Chiss as a Force user to maybe help, because we don't really know if there's like some grand master of these navigators or how they develop how they get attuned to the Force to be able to navigate through the galaxy like that. Mm-hmm. So I think they'll be part of that story being told as well, like where this is going to go. And I really wouldn't be surprised. This is totally like tinfoil hat material, but if in some capacity, whatever we're seeing come back from the unknown regions in The Rise of Skywalker, if one of these two guys shows up, I wouldn't have believed that before. And I hate to like get into that kind of territory, but like, I feel like there's some pretty big plans for Thrawn. And then also after watching the finale last night, for Ezra, obviously, as well. What about you?
So I'm not as sold on the episode 9 aspect of it, but I would say the tinfoil hat method of saying, what if we get, the TV show or another new trilogy of stories that does involve Ezra and Thrawn in the unknown regions with the Chiss, all fighting the Grisk and that whole like war, and they could do it really big. And all of it is happening adjacent to the rest of what was happening with Rey and all these other characters, Mon Mothma and all that stuff like happening with the New Republic in the regular old galaxy. You know, they could have this big war and they could have this big thing happening over here through some sort of storytelling method over the course of that 30 years or however they want to do it. And then it would be really neat for whatever reason or another to have, you know, those characters come back, maybe even Thrawn as an ally to Ezra. Like when he shows up, Sabine's like, what the heck? And it's like, he's with me, you know? And it's like a big surprise because we've learned him now to be a protagonist, but you know, maybe they kind of play him like he started here, and Thrawn's character ends up being someone who kind of, I don't know, I can't imagine him being like for the greater good kind of thing. Yeah. I don't know, like a good guy necessarily. I always imagine him being this militaristic person, but I don't know. As we want to wrap this thing up, did you have a favorite part of the book? Anything that stuck out to you as like, even if you did or didn't like it, like what was your go-to moment?
Oh, absolutely. That first meeting between, I spoke about earlier, but that first meeting between Tarkin, Savit, Krennic's lackey Ronan, and then the Emperor just kind of sitting there like you can tell, I think Zahn even mentions like the Emperor seems kind of amused that all these guys are like pushing each other and trying to manipulate one another. And he's like, man, I've taught these pupils of mine so well, kind of. So that was my favorite, is just seeing all those characters kind of come together. And Tarkin also kind of priming Savit to know that, you know, he's secretly rooting for Thrawn, but he has to remain objective, but kind of also feeding Savit like Krennic's weaknesses and ways to kind of gaslight Krennic during this meeting. I thought that was really, really interesting. So how about yourself?
My first answer was going to be, I really like the end with the Emperor, and all that stuff that takes place about those conversations. But I have to be honest with you. One of the standout moments in the book for me, as weird as it sounds, is when Thrawn was first tasked with shooting off these giant Minocs, which I can't remember what they're called. But there's literally like a scene where he's like, okay, it's sitting there. And I almost like the way it was written, I could like picture the whole thing. There's this giant thing and it's sitting there. And then they like hit it with a blast of a certain particular kind. And then it like flies away. And then they hit it with another one. And then they test it on this one. And there was something about Thrawn being given the information like, we already tried that, it's not going to work, or we already know this. And he's like, I don't care, do it again, because I haven't tested it. I'm doing the testing now. And there was this interesting thing of like, as it continued to go on, he was able to kind of put everything together. And I think that scene alone is almost something that you could kind of throw somebody or show somebody for the first time, be like, this is Thrawn. He's being given all the information they have, and they've been doing this for over a year. And in a matter of like 10 or 20 minutes, he was able to like piece together stuff that they had never done, because he just wanted to do it from his own point of view. And I think that's interesting. What about a score ranking? Where do you fit this in? Give me either a number or maybe something like it's similar in your ranking to another book, maybe of the franchise. If you liked blank, you probably like this.
I would say I would give it an 8 out of 10 if I was going to give a numerical score. That's kind of where all these books have landed on me. I really appreciate the approach, the writing. I think Zahn does a great job with what he's given. Obviously, he can't develop the character too far. But I think it's a great story, and I think that he did a really good job of kind of like what you said. It's a whodunit, and you're not really realizing it's a whodunit until the very end, until you kind of go back and think about everything that's happened. Books that I would compare it to, like I would say if you enjoyed Inferno Squad or Catalyst, I think you would definitely enjoy that. And I enjoyed both of those books very much. So how about yourself?
I'm thinking I'm down a little bit on you on the 7. I think the 7 out of 10 is probably where I'd place it. I think mostly I kind of categorize things as like I don't know, it's kind of hard in the Star Wars thing more than like how I categorize movies, but I tend to think of 5 as like where I just kind of don't care, and the 4 is like where I start not liking it. But I tend to like most Star Wars books because they're Star Wars, so it's kind of tricky there. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I do feel like a 7 is a solid score for it, because it's right smack in the middle of like, it does do something for you, but it doesn't do like a whole lot. Like you can't miss this kind of a book. And 7 lands right there for me. Compared to other books, I mean, I hate to be so lame, but like if you like the first Thrawn, you'll probably like this one.
Yeah.
that to me is a simple thing, but if you got into that book but you didn't like alliances, give this one a shot. You might actually find it interesting to see characters that maybe you followed all the way through both stories and where they end up. It's kind of hard to not want somebody to have read both of those but not read the third one, so give it a little bit of closure. But yeah, I think that's it. Anything else you want to add to this?
No, I totally agree with you. This goes, obviously if you enjoyed the first 2 Thrawn books, check this one out for sure. And where I would rank it in those is like, I think as with you as well, Treason is my favorite, the first Thrawn second, and then Alliance is last. So yeah.
It's funny as a final point, and this is kind of going back to the thing. I forgot to mention the whole thing about how it was odd that in this book they never mentioned that the gas chamber blew up, because when we saw that in Rebels, Thrawn pops back in a hologram and is like, "Hey, I'm aware of what you did, and you're gonna have to deal with that." And they don't really ever mention it in this book, which the timeline for this book is like he should have found out or heard about that like midway through this book, or near the end at least. But it seems like he gets all the way through the book and has never hadn't heard that information yet. So it's kind of strange, but
yeah, especially when there's so many people kind of gunning for him too. Like you feel like somebody would kind of poke him with that, like, well, your gas chamber exploded, that kind of thing. But
your fuel line or whatever. Yeah.
Totally. That's a very good point. Yeah. So,
all right, guys. Well, I think that's it. That's just about all the time we have to talk about Thrawn Treason. I want you guys to put your thoughts on the book in the comments below, and also, what was your favorite part? That's a big thing to us. What was it about this book that you actually liked? Leave that stuff in the comments, and we'll be sure to hit you back. Until next time, we'll see you guys around.
Thanks, guys.